Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks to those who are even willing to sit up front. It filled right up from the back, straight up this way. So I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at Holy Cross, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, discussions, performances, and other events that foster dialogue on campus about meaning, morality, and mutual obligation across the different disciplines. You can find more about upcoming events on our website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, and I hope pretty soon this talk will also be recorded in there so you can tell your friends what they missed and they can watch it in their dorm rooms. Today I'm really happy to welcome David Kyuman Kim for a talk with a heavy but important title. I feel it's hard to do justice to it in an introduction. The talk is titled Choosing Love, Bearing the Weight of the Other. I want to thank Professor Benny Liu of the class of 1956, Professor of New Testament Studies, for suggesting this event and making it happen. David Kim is Professor of Religious Studies and American Studies at Connecticut College, where he serves as the college's inaugural director of the Center for Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity. He's been written on freedom and agency in modernity and postmodernity, on Asian American diasporas, and on Asian American religious experience. He's the author of Melancholic Freedom, Agency, and the Spirit of Politics, and co-editor of The Post-Secular in Question. He also co-edited a special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. He's focused on race, religion, and late democracy in that work. Professor Kim has served as senior advisor to the Social Science Research Council's program on religion in the public sphere. He's editor-at-large of The Immanent Frame, the SSRC's important blog on secularism, religion, and the public sphere. He's also a creative consultant, scholar-in-residence, and board member for David Dorfman Dance on a very different front. His current project is The Public Life of Love, an examination of the status of love in politics, public life, religion, and the arts. And that's the basis for which he's going to talk today. So I'm looking forward to that. Please join me in welcoming David Kim.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? I realize I have this TED Talk thing here. I want to thank you for welcoming me. I want to thank my dear friend Benny Liu also for the invitation. Benny and I have known each other for a long while. And you know Benny as a teacher and colleague. I've known him as a great scholar of New Testament and Asian American theology, incredibly important figure in my field, in fields as it were, and I've always been grateful to be in dialogue with him. I should say, Benny was asking me if I've ever been here before, and my sister was born here in Worcester. I think she knows that, I'm not sure yet, but, I lived here for a couple of years right after we immigrated to the United States. It looks a little different, I must admit. All right. So, are you all comfortable here? Are you sure? Okay. I feel like you're in that front row of the movies, movie theater. Okay. So, as you heard, this is a part of a chapter that I'm working on this book called The Public Life of Love. Over the years, I've been increasingly trying to work on what might be called either public intellectual work or public scholarship. Which is to say, to try to make kind of the hard thinking work that we do at places like Connecticut College or Holy Cross, not just accessible, but in dialogue with the public sphere and people out there in the world. This is a set of ruminations, again, about the status of love in our common lives, in politics, and here, as you'll hear in the paper, in our intimate lives as well. So what I'll do is I'll read a bit of the paper, I'll show a little movie, I'll read a little bit more, and then we can have a conversation. All right. Are you all, most of you are students here? Yeah? Wow. Good to know. Good to know. All right. So let's begin with questions that speak a lament. How might we begin to make accessible public love, where the public love in question is marked by compassion and the feeling for the suffering of others? How might we overcome resistance to feeling public love? And how might we enact public love when the feeling is absent or when experience dictates otherwise? In other words, how might we choose love? Now, I ask these questions of lament in light of what feels like an endless succession of breakdowns in social civility and political possibility in American common life. These are breakdowns I would pin, at least in significant part, to residing cultures of what I call lovelessness, which is to say the emotionally deficient cultures of compulsive cool, cynicism, irony, snark, detachment, and mannered diffidence and disaffection. Even the thoroughly pervasive entanglements of social media like Instagram, Snapchat, or Facebook that purport to connect and bind us across great expanses and cultural, social, and political divides it still seems awfully hard to say that there's a noticeable and notable mobilization of public love. What sort of affectively meaningful connections do we have available in public life, particularly relationships that evince care for the pain and suffering, for the unfamiliar, for the distant and the remote? Now, by public, I'm invoking a general sense of forms of sociality, mutual regard and acknowledgement or recognition, or the lack thereof, structured by varying degrees of social and cultural and political norms and conventions that in turn reflect and constitute identities and behavior. Publics have spatial and temporal dimensions, meaning common parameters of physical boundedness and common rhythms of the passage of time. They also have moral qualities that shape behavior in social and political dynamics. And publics also have aesthetic dimensions of value and judgment. And all of these features of the public have, I contend, affective dimensions. Now, exploring the public life of love, to choose love, as it were, what I will also be calling public love, my concern is for how and why love and its variants, meaning empathy, compassion, and mercy, are found and not, expressed and not, lived and not in public life. What forms of caring sociality might serve as generative prospects for public life, especially for the prospects of generating and sustaining compassion under what feels like increasingly loveless conditions? One only needs to look at our election season. We don't have to be partisan about this, but the rise of a figure like Donald Trump is concerning. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that America, or for that matter, any society, has witnessed a thriving culture of public love. Nor am I anticipating a cultural revolution, Bernie or otherwise, animated by public love to emerge in the near term, or really any term. I'm not imagining utopias of the appearance of widespread public love. Nevertheless, it seems clear that the insufficient attention to public love has allowed a political culture in America of enmity and an indifference to the poor and suffering to persist. So let's turn for a moment or two to an unsettling account of the absence of public love. A quarter century after publishing On Photography, her extraordinary set of meditations on the photographic image and our effective and moral responses to them, the great essayist and public intellectual Susan Sontag published an update in the form of a monograph-length essay called Regarding the Pain of Others. Now, in both texts, Sontag's preoccupation is for the absence of feeling and compassion for the suffering of distant others. Modern photography has perpetuated the maintenance of emotional distance from suffering, Sontag argues. We experience photography as voyeurs, outsiders looking but not engaging the lives and deaths of others. Sontag's concern is for the seeming indifference and dulled, inured feelings we voyeurs have upon seeing images of extreme suffering and misery. Amongst its moral uses, war photography, for example, serve as messages, accounts, and forms of witness to the suffering of others. These photographs are what Sontag calls species of rhetoric. They reinstate, they simplify, they agitate, they form consensus. Look, the photograph says, which is to say that photographs serve as modes of address. They speak to one public or another. Now, in regard to the war photography she focuses on in Sarajevo, Rwanda, 9/11, sites in New York and Washington, D.C., Sontag incants a lament about our indifference to the victims shown in these images, to the absence of feeling and compassion. In the face of the pain of others, why don't we feel their suffering? Or rather, why do we feel so little in the face of the suffering of these victims of war and other atrocities? Indeed, how is it possible that we can resist feeling affected by the sight of the pain and suffering of others? Sontag asks, when we are looking at other people's pains, what do we see? What do we feel? Who do we see? In being addressed by the pain of others through war photographs, why are we not moved and positively affected? Why do we feel so little when bearing witness to atrocity and war ruins and respond with indifference? What can we do to break from the impulse to dissociate from the pain and suffering of others? And we saw this in the image that was floating around the internet for that child, that refugee that was washed ashore. Right? A great deal of what seemed like deep feeling that lasted but for a moment. Right? What was done in the wake of that? Now, there are obvious answers here that have to do with the different affective responses we have to the familiar versus the strange, which is to say, our impulses to alight to regarding others as generic rather than as specific others, general rather than particular people. After all, atrocities are by their nature unbearable to look at. It's unbearable to turn one's gaze from them. We tend to recoil in horror, and we recess from the ruinous. Visual atrocities are overwhelming. They're literally too much to watch. Familiarity, on the other hand, dictated by the spatial parameters of proximity and distance, can demand discretion for the proximate and permitted indiscretion or objectification and spectatorship for the distant, as in the response to the far-off scenes of war. Which is to say, the near, by which I mean the proximate, the familiar, the friendly, and the far, which I mean the distant, the strange, the inimical, reflect actual physical gaps between ourselves and others, as well as the emotional gaps and disconnections that separate. Our perceptions and experiences of proximity and distance keep us from affective engagement. Perceived distance and proximity animate, I'm arguing, the dynamic life of public love. Sontag suggests that indifference to images of suffering and pain reflect fear as much as detachment. Fears of complicity with the atrocity, fears of approximation of the suffering and pain of others will reflect how that suffering and pain will reflect on the quality of our attentiveness and lack thereof to the local suffering and pain. Tellingly, the absence of emotion, what we might call blankness or detachment or indifference, also reflects a reigning sense of impotence, where sentiments like nothing can be done in regard to war or in regard to alleviating the pain and suffering of others prevails. And that impotence, that sense of impotence, can become oppressive. In this way, emotional disconnection and detachment reveal a form or mode of impotence. We are, or perhaps fear that we are, powerless to help the other. Subsequently, sympathy, Sontag argues, marks an abandonment of responsibility. Even compassion, according to Sontag, does not suffice as a moral response to war. Now, Sontag's concern is with stress-testing dominant emotional repertoires that keep distances intact to those who suffer. Sympathy maintains a distance to suffering. It is, in Sontag's estimation, a failure and a capitulation that the gap between the self and the other, between viewer and sufferer, is a permanent one. Cynicism similarly casts the suffering of others as banal, that is, acceptable, ordinary, unexceptional, as well as abstract, meaning unreal, distant. I draw on Sontag not to take issue so much with her analysis as such, but as a way of setting the table. I'd like to ask that we take her conclusions as an affective condition that we need to address. Now, the rest of the talk is going to focus on Tony Kushner's great epic play, Angels in America. Amongst the students, how many of you know Angels in America? Ever heard? One, two. Okay. That's right? So just a little background. Kushner, let me see, the seniors, you're 21 and a half years old? Something like that, right? So Kushner was about 26 or 27 when he began writing this great epic play about the decline of American exceptionalism, but also the AIDS crisis in the mid-1980s. This play appeared in about 96 and 98. It appears in 2 parts, 6 hours in total. If you have not read the play, or if you have not, it's hard to see the play, I would encourage you to, HBO had done a version of this in 6 parts that you can watch online. I would strongly encourage you. It's an amazing, amazing feat. Really one of the great achievements of American theater in the late 20th century. He paid me to say all that, but yes, I would encourage you to see it. Okay. So, in the final act of Perestroika, which is part 2 of the great epic play of Angels in America, Tony Kushner presents a most uncanny scene in the midst of an opera of uncanny scenes, namely a Kaddish, a Jewish prayer for the dead, recited for the most loathsome figure of the play, and one of the most loathsome figures of American history, namely Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn has succumbed to AIDS in the play, and in real life as well. As we know, Cohn was an archangel of the American right and conservatism in the 1950s. His rise to national prominence came as the chief counsel to Joseph McCarthy, the notorious anti-communist champion of the US Senate. Cohn was a prosecutor in the espionage case against Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, amongst other things. Amongst Cohn's most damnable acts was to exact illegal influence with the judge in the case to impose the death penalty against the Rosenbergs. Indeed, Ethel Rosenberg is one of the spirits and characters we see in Angels in America. She is a ghost who haunts Roy once he receives his diagnosis of AIDS. Roy is the amoral core of the play, the foil to the American national themes Kushner explores throughout both parts of Angels. In Angels, 2 of the main characters, Roy and Prior Walter, are stricken with AIDS. And while Prior and Roy never meet in the play, they are both spiritual mediators between the human and the supernatural, between the worldly and the spirits, and in effect serve as archetypes of the declining American imperium. Powermongers in decline, Roy, and the prophetic martyrs from the underside and underrepresented, Prior. Prior is a prophet of American hope and survival, a sympathetic figure of suffering abandoned by his lover, Lewis. Roy, on the other hand, is a Faustian devil at the tail end of a lifetime of damnable bargains. This is a fictive rendering of the real-world Roy Cohn, that demon of the American right wing. Now, within the context of the play, as Kushner writes, Roy is, quote, a hero of the American right and to the conservative movement. To the American left, he is, as Lewis, Prior's partner, vents, the pole star of human evil. Roy is a self-loathing gay man. Earlier in the play, upon receiving his AIDS diagnosis from his doctor, Roy inveighs with great indignation that he neither has AIDS nor is a homosexual. Quote, only homosexuals get AIDS, he tells his doctor. Roy refuses to identify as homosexual because, as he continues, homosexuals have no power, no influence, no status. I am someone who happens to have sex with other men. I am not a homosexual, declares Roy. And his actual diagnosis? Liver cancer, he says. In other words, an acceptable disease for Roy, for all intents and purposes. It turns out that Roy is a queer traitor. Now, as a figure of power and influence, Roy has secured a private stash of AZT, then the most promising drug to treat AIDS, which in the setting of the plays in the 1980s is still an experimental treatment for AIDS. There's much more to lay out from Kushner's extraordinary play. For the purposes of this meditation on public love, let's focus on the scene in Angels after Roy has died. Upon Roy's death, Belize, the cross-dressing queer black nurse who has been charged with caring for Roy in the hospital, seizes the opportunity to secure Roy's stash of AZT. Despite his enmity for Roy, Belize feels compelled to have the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, recited on behalf of Roy. This is an extraordinary act in light of who Cohn was and is in American history and in the play, particularly given his loathing for the marginalized, for the atopos of the American exceptionalist mythology. The Kaddish is, after all, traditionally recited after the passing of a beloved, not for the vilified, not for whom the living have disaffection. So I'm going to show you the clip, the scene. Nice. I never use images, so this is very exciting for me. So Cohen has died at this point. I just gave you the setup for the scene. So we'll just watch a few minutes of it. And that's, what's her name? Emma Thompson as the angel.
Hurry. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh, this is too weird for words. It's Roy Cohn. It's so creepy here. I hate hospitals.
Stop whining. We have to move fast.
I'm supposed to call the duty nurse if his condition changes, and it's changed. Take off those glasses. You look ridiculous. What happened to you?
Expiation for my sins. Now, what am I doing here?
Expiation for your sins. I can't take this stuff out myself. I have to tell them he's dead and fill out all the forms, and I don't want them confiscating the medicine. It's AZT. Nearly 60 bottles left. I needed a pack mule, so I called you.
Why me? You hate me.
Needed a Jew. You were the first to come to mind.
What do you mean you needed a Jew?
We're gonna thank him for the pills.
Thank him.
What do you call the Jewish prayer for the dead?
The Kaddish?
That's the one. Hit it.
Whoa, hold
Do
on.
it. Do it. They'll be
I'm
here in
not
a
saying
second.
Kaddish
There's
for
nothing to
him.
remember.
The drugs, okay, fine, sure, but no fucking way am I praying for him. My New Deal pinko parents in Schenectady would never forgive me. They're already so disappointed. He's a fag, he's an office temp, but now look, he's saying Kaddish for Roy Cohn. I can't believe you'd actually pray for him.
Louis, I'd even pray for you. He was a terrible person. He died a hard death. So, maybe a queen can forgive her vanquished foe. It isn't easy. It doesn't count if it's easy. It's the hardest thing. Forgiveness. Maybe that's where love and justice finally meet. Peace, at least. Isn't that what the Kaddish asks for?
It's Hebrew or Aramaic or something. Who knows what it's asking? I'm 32 years old and I've never been in a room with a dead body before. It's so heavy and small. I know probably less of the Kaddish than you do, Belize. I'm an intensely secular Jew. I didn't even bar mitzvah.
Do the best you can.
Yisgadal v'Yisgadash. Shemay Rabbah, Shemay to good show. Beret Pri Hagaf. No, it's the Kiddush, nothing. Shema Yisrael. I don't know. This is silly, please. I can't.
Alma Divra Hirusei V'Yamlich Malchusei
Palman Divrach Hirusei, V'Yamlich Machusei.
V'Rayachon Uv'Yomechon Uv'Chaye Dechol Beis Yisrael
Begayachon Uv'Yomechon Uv'Chaye Dechol Beis Yisrael.
Agalo V'Zman Korif
V'Yimru Amen.
Yehi Shmei Rabo Muvarach L'Olam U'Lomei Omayam
Yisparach V'Yishtabach V'Yispoar V'Yisroman V'Yisnasei V'Yisadar V'Yisalei V'Yisalo Shemei Dekudasho Tushbachoso V'Nechemoso Damiron V'Omo V'Imru Omen Yehi Shlomo Rabo Min Shemayo V'Chaim Olenu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imru Omen.
Ose Shalom Bimromov Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael
Ose Shalom Bimromov Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael
Bimru Omen
V'Imru Omen.
You son of a bitch.
You son of a bitch.
Thank you, Louis. fine.
Fine. What are you talking about? Fine. That was fucking miraculous.
So, how are you to read this scene? What moral psychology, meaning what's motivating is operating here for the characters? Meaning what is motivating to undertake the Kaddish? What moves them to enact this act of love? Is it simply gratitude for the gift of the AZT? Is it miraculous and therefore inexplicable and out of reach? And what might we learn from Kushner about the possibilities of public love under loveless conditions? Now, in the program note for the National Theater production of Angels, Kushner underscores that the case of Roy Cohn was apocryphal and yet moral. And this is Kushner. AIDS is what finally outed Roy Cohn. The ironies surrounding his death engendered a great deal of homophobic commentary, and among gay men and lesbians, considerable introspection. How broad, how embracing was our sense of community? Did it encompass an implacable foe like Roy? Was he one of us? So, here we have a clue to Kushner's intentions about interrogating and stress testing the limits of the queer community and the ideological demands of solidarity. Was he one of us? Kushner is not simply tweaking the reactive and reactionary habits of identity politics, although there's some of that operating in the play. Instead, I'm arguing Kushner is operating a moral, deliberative space for the possibility of a politics of affection and breaching that which keeps our compassion, which is to say, our hearts, in check. Why do Belize, and subsequently Lewis and Ethel, feel compelled to recite the Kaddish? Is it out of some sense of public obligation, a moral obligation, a spiritual one? It's important to note that performing the Kaddish is a hybrid duty. It is an obligation that has public and private valences. The Kaddish is a public act of obligation, a plea to and a praise to God. And it's a prayer of exaltation that only indirectly commands the deceased to peace. It's also a ritual of reverence, again, most commonly performed by a son for a lost father. So let's return to Sontag's question about that which keeps us from engaging the politics of affection, which is to say a politics animated by love and compassion, what I also call elsewhere love-driven politics. It's helpful to consider the analogy to another act of public mourning here and love, namely the contemplation of burial in Sophocles' Antigone. Now, the precedent of Antigone is, of course, a tragic one. Antigone seeks to fulfill a moral and filial obligation, the forbidden burial of her brother, deemed a traitor by the king, her uncle, Creon. Now, the tragic condition of Antigone is between incommensurable conceptions of the good, between conflicts of opposing worldviews and principles. Now, the tragedy unfolds as it becomes clear that there are competing and not easily sublated demands between obligations to kith and kin and obligations to the state, meaning family and the state. These are, according to the parameters of Sophocles' tragedy, incommensurable principles that serve as a moral core of each of these obligations, famously rendered by Hegel as the irreconcilability between the good and the right. The tragic conflict stands in the presumption of an unbreachable divide between political and moral enemies. The classical precedent I'm drawing upon here is the anguish and ambivalence presented in Antigone in wrestling with making judgments about rituals of mourning as sanctioned or forbidden. Antigone and Creon are antagonists, and there is a body in the room, as it were. Now, in Angels in America, the conflict, or at least the reasons for potential conflict and moral hesitation in regard to performing the Kaddish, is not so much a tragic matter, but rather one of integrity. More specifically, moral conflict and hesitation arises when the consideration of undertaking particular acts might affirm or defy one's received sense of integrity. And here, the mourning rituals in question, the burial in Antigone, the Kaddish in Angels, poses a test of integrity. In existentialist terms, these rituals of mourning present limit situations. Choosing to perform or not perform these rites speak to the terms and conditions of the moral and spiritual integrity of the actors. Now, by integrity, I'm referring to the measure of one's character that comes into sharp relief at defining moments of purpose and meaning, and in which we judge in accordance to how we how we answer questions such as, what kind of person am I? To whom do I make myself accountable? to what ideals and values? Where do my political, moral, and spiritual commitments lie? Who are my partners and comrades? Who are the objects of my heart? And for whom do I freely extend my heart? Now, in both Antigone and Angels, there is a forceful impulse to refuse compassion toward the suffering of a foe. From Creon, the enemy is Antigone's brother, Polynices. For Belize, Lewis, and Ethel in Angels, it is Roy. The impulse is to refuse or ignore the suffering, to forego honoring the foe, even in death. Now, initially, it is a statement that it is too much to turn one's heart toward the enemy, to reconsider the foe worthy of one's love. There was no love shared prior to death, no love shared in life. To mourn a vanquished foe is to defy one's political commitments. The imperative to bury and mourn is to comply with one's rendering of, quote, doing the right thing. It's a moral compulsion. But is it an act of moral affect and care? In other words, is it an act of public love? Now, for Antigone, the answer is, of course, yes. For Creon, the status of the body and the ritual burial present more difficult propositions. He conceives his integrity through maintaining his consistency with the sanctions of the state and the greater good and political sovereignty. For Belize, occasioning the Kaddish is a reconciliation and an act of gratitude for the gift of the AZT. Lewis is the least reflective and the most reactionary. And to quote, and I'll do the PG-13 version. I'm not saying any effing Kaddish for him. The drugs are okay, sure, fine, but no effing way am I praying for him. My New Deal pinko communist parents in Schenectady would never forgive me. They're already so disappointed. He's a fag, he's an office temp, and now, look, he's saying Kaddish for Roy Cohn. I can't believe you'd pray for him. The prayer quorum in the Kaddish, what is traditionally called the minyan, here represented by Ethel and Lewis, is not always an act of unmitigated public love. It's not a suspension of enmity and antipathy. After all, in Angels, Ethel and Lewis end the Kaddish with saying, "You son of a bitch." The memory and experience of their own pain and suffering at the hands of Roy have not been forgotten. And yet, we should ask, in serving as the Kaddish Minyan, have they forgiven him? Probably not. It is instead the instantiation of a politics of affection and the constitution of a constituency of alterity, of queer sociality, and Jewish solidarity. How do we make sense of the solidarity and sociality of public love presented in this ritual mourning? Again, the existential tests of integrity rendered through acts of defiance and of convention and identity are important to consider. In this sense, the mourning imperative of the constituency of alterity, of difference, is, I'm arguing, the formation of this queer counterpublic, born of moral love. Belize and Lewis defy identity politics on the one hand, and on the other, they also thwart the negative judgments of the value and worth of the other, namely Roy. Earlier in the play, Belize and Roy have an exchange in which Belize declares that as a queer black man, he is Roy's negation. Right? Someone who avows his queerness, someone who avows his difference. Roy doing the opposite. Now, Ethel must defy her hatred of Roy even in her own afterlife. And for all, there's a defiance of the belief that the distance that lies between them and then the inimical other cannot be closed. In short, it is to defy and deny a piety that dictates that there is no possibility in rendering any measure of affective proximity. Choosing love. Is this public love? Is this act of mourning, praying the Kaddish, an instance or an expression of the public life of love? What do we learn from this Kaddish scene in Angels in America about breaching unbreachable gaps that divide us through politics, morality, and even religion? Now, Kushner does not present the Kaddish as a resolution to a tragic conflict, as we've already noted. Roy is not Creon, abandoning his refusal of burial rites and his prioritization of the right of the state over the goods of the family and the gods. Lewis and Ethel are not Antigones. who have given up their dogmatic loyalties to their own. And Belize is not Tiresias, the seer blind to the world in Antigone. Belize sees quite clearly what he does and what needs to take place. Roy is a loveless spirit, and he is awfully hard to love. One can easily imagine Sontag's disaffected voyeur here, feeling only diffidence in the face of the suffering Roy. Roy is and was an enemy. Kirchner joins Sontag in presenting the ungrieved, and in all likelihood, ungrievable Roy as a challenge to our intuitions, to avoid love, to avoid the suffering of a distant spirit. Why should we feel connection to this sufferer's soul? How does one love this unforgivable man? Why should one forgive and offer love to him? Roy was not simply an agent of moral and political evil in American history. He was, as I suggested earlier, a queer traitor. He was a self-loathing homosexual who equates identification with homosexuality with weakness, as lacking power and the ability to get things done. He denies his own diagnosis of AIDS because it is a disease of homosexuals. So why pray for him? Why engage a morning prayer conventionally recited for the passing of a loved one, in particular after the passing of a beloved father? Pity? Is it cynicism? Now, it seems to me that the Kaddish represents a relief and release from pity and cynicism, from the impulse to say there's nothing to be done, or to disavow the suffering of another, especially of a foe, of an enemy. The prayer releases Lewis and Belize. It's an act of mercy, and as I suggested earlier, an act of queer solidarity. But is it an act of public love? Not in any conventional sense, I would say. They say the prayers in the confines of a private hospital room, after all. The minyan is, as I suggested just now, a counter-public. After all, no conventional public is there to witness a Kaddish other than Ethel and God. Yet, there is another spiritual cohort witnessing the ritual, of course. We, the audience. Which is to say, a public that is in formation, that comes into being in our participation as witnesses to the drama of angels in America itself. What of Ethel? What do we make of her? Participating in the Kaddish is also an act of mercy on Ethel's part. She resists the impulse to dissociate from the suffering of an inimical other, her vanquished foe. Ethel emerges from the shadows in a rabbinic role. She's an ancestor who knows the prayer, who fully appreciates the gravity of the Kaddish, and subsequently affirms ethnic and religious cohesion with Roy as Jews. Enacting a morning prayer, designated not only as an exaltation of God, but as a passage of a beloved father, marks a claim that Roy's suffering, the suffering of this distant other, has a lot to do with us. Now, such acts might occasion a reconsideration of our meta-moral commitments, meaning the ones we find embedded in our collective and individual psyches. Love thine enemy? Really? We've heard this phrase, right? The golden rule is lovingly exacting, but as an imperative and a mode of moral psychology, it is horrifying and even atrocious in its expectations. After all, entailed in loving one's enemy is a call to entertain and perform a love without precedent, a public love, perhaps of forgiveness. After all, for Ethel Rosenberg, performing the Kaddish for her persecutor is an astonishing act of mercy and even compassion. By soliciting Lewis and Ethel as mourners in a Kaddish for Roy, Belize is also closing the divide between friend and enemy. Recall Belize's plea when he says that to pray for Roy is an act of forgiveness. This is Belize, which is maybe where love and justice finally meet. Peace at last. Isn't that what the Kaddish asks for? Praying for peace for a vanquished foe's soul is, Kirchner is suggesting, an act of forgiveness. The Kaddish transfigures the heart such that even the one who loathes can recite forgiveness. It is solidarity, not reconciliation, though. Now let's be clear on this point. Forgiveness is not forgetting. The Kaddish represents the formation of a constituency of otherness, of difference, what I've been calling the solidarity of queer politics. There's a suspension rather than a disavowal of politics and the political. But there's still the hard question to answer. Is it love? What kind of love do we witness in Kushner's cottage? It does not appear to be a love of affection. There's no love lost. It speaks more to love's failures, which is to say, the inability to love and the possibility of forgiveness. It is a forgiveness that collapses affective distance between friend and enemy. It brings suffering into proximity, not necessarily inducing conventional forms of love. I'm arguing again, in the end, that public love is unconventional. And I go even a bit further and call this act of counter-public love mercy, or even grace. By grace, I'm referring to both to the notion that forgiveness is a gift, but also the sense of grace suggested in the act of making space for another, precisely by closing the gap that exists between ourselves and another. Just as loneliness maintains an abiding concern for love and the loss of love, the lovelorn self is just as surely haunted by questions of trust, loyalty, and uncertainty about one's worth and worthiness, most acutely experienced in disappearance and in death. This is a conundrum of familial love found, for example, in Shakespeare's King Lear, in which a father demands true, genuine love from his children, and yet cannot bring himself to acknowledge when they attempt to show him that love. The tragedy of misunderstanding, of desire, disappointment, and disaffection refracts intimate disaffection into the fever dreams of modernity, of isolation, of loneliness, of alienation. Sontag names fear and dread as a root source for our inability to fear and ably regard the suffering and pain of others. But it's an incomplete diagnosis, I think. We are afraid to engage our affective, loving faculties and resist extending ourselves toward distant, suffering others, perhaps because we suspect we will not love well or freely. Surely our love may not be ably reciprocated by the distant, vanquished other, but we also may have preemptive worries, like King Lear, that we might not be able to acknowledge love shown, nor love received. And hence we have surfaced yet another reason why it is strenuous and difficult to render love public. It's not so hard then to recognize that compassion for a vanquished foe, a loathsome enemy, does not necessarily represent a gesture of expectation to love. It is not politics that demands a public love of mourning, of praying for a vanquished foe. Indeed, it seems implausible that any of the queer characters in Angels would have undertaken the cottage if they simply held onto possessive investments in the wounds of identity politics. The cottage in this configuration would have marked betrayal, a political betrayal. Now, Kushner, I'm arguing, is pressing another issue here, namely the regions of affect that are unavailable to us through our politics and our conventional sociality. Can we ever fully and truly know the heart of another? Even those we consider to be our most dear and intimate, like a child or a parent or a partner. Aren't we mostly, if not always, stuck with mere glimpses of such love? Or even worse, presented with behavior that we take as evidence of a betrayal of that love? We feel shame in wanting, demanding what we cannot have. One could ask, why and how could I expect so much as signs of true love? Why do I doubt the love of the one I love? Why do I acknowledge as what do I acknowledge as expressions of genuine love? There are challenges to reconciling the isolation of the loveless self with the public imperatives of democracy, particularly in regard to the democratic calls for solidarity and purpose. Surely one route from the isolation of lovelessness to democracy is to cultivate the willingness to bear witness and presence to the experiences of suffering and of helplessness. This is why it's so challenging to collapse those distances of the heart and to imagine proximity to distant others. Sontag's lament of the dissociation from the suffering of others and of the unbreachable distances between us have proximate representations of the suffering at hand, the photographs, remember. It speaks to our inability to identify. Kushner, in contrast, offers a glimpse of public love that challenges our shaky hold on our possibility of genuine love. As moderns, late post or otherwise, we inherit from King Lear's Cordelia a motherless life of abandonment. Not only abandonment by caregivers, but the loss of confidence in our ability to acknowledge, recognize, and accept care when given. It's this condition that brings us to ask about the possibility of forgiveness, if not love, in the wake of the modern condition of lovelessness. No doubt, it is often difficult to forgive, let alone forget the harm inflicted by others, which is to say, all of us. Disappointment and disaffection structure ordinary life. After all, when, if ever, do any of us fully meet the expectations of the love that others have of us? Lovelessness is also about heartbreak, about sorrow. How might we render the possibilities for fruitful grieving, of public yet effective mourning that hinges on retelling the affect of sympathy and an openness to compassion for others as well as for ourselves? Now, in regard to grief and lovelessness, the cottage scene in Angels suggests that we might discover instances of public love by turning to the rituals of mourning that are available in ordinary life. We might ask if skepticism-derived anxieties might be prevented, at least in part, by giving greater credence to the rituals of mourning and grieving available to us through traditions of various sorts. Which is to say, bodily practices that bring people together, not necessarily always for rational reasons. Surely the problem of blindly following rituals persists here. I would contend that one can find solace and perhaps even solidarity in the self-care of the ritualization of the body in the everyday. Rituals that can range from small acts, such as the shaking of hands, or the bowing of heads, or the hugging of other bodies, or the kiss on the cheek, to more engaging rituals that require preparation and prefiguring, like sending a child off to school, or issuing thoughtful remembrances on anniversaries and memorials, engaging in the inevitably inadequate and often awkward search for words and touches at departures. I think often of airports in these terms as scenes and sites of rupture and sadness at leavings, of disappearances. The public life of love does not have, nor should it take, a single expression. Even if what persistently arises is that compassion is our model, is the prominent and instructive example of public love we keep coming back to. The public life of love can and should take various expressions. It most certainly reflects and refracts bridging great divides between and amongst peoples. Again, compassion is crucial here. It evinces a movement away from insular subjectivity. Does this mean that public love demands suppressing personal forms of love, such that the personal and the intimate are at odds with public love? No, it doesn't. What I'm highlighting are uncanny experiences, like solidarity out of mourning for a vanquished foe, that make for public love. Public love forces a reconsideration of personal and intimate forms of love. Now, this is not to say that all forms of love fall into a harmonious and constant continuum. Questions of identity are central to this consideration of the public life of love. Our sense of who we are finds expressions in how we love, as well as whom we find ourselves loving, whom we choose to love, and whom we choose not to love. It is not simply that we, as love-shorn, love-starved selves, are uncertain whether we are in possession of the love of others or are loved by another. Instead, adding to the complexity, we are often, again, quite unsure whether we are worthy of love itself. It's a marker of humility. Self-loathing keeps us from not just loving ourselves, but also loving others and receiving the love of others. The public life of love is messy, I would argue. It is often unanticipated and difficult. And it can oblige us to come face to face with those whom we find hard to love. Remember, love thine enemy. Those we find it difficult to love, where loving response is not immediate, but one that has to be found. We can risk breaking out of our lovelessness by extending ourselves, by risking who we are, by being open and vulnerable not only to the possibility of the love and worth of others, but also to the possibility that we might find and value love and worth in ourselves as well. Thank you. Thank you. Do we do questions at Holy Cross? We do questions at Holy Cross. All right. I don't know if we do answers, but we might do questions. Please.
So my family may have, I really appreciate what you said about ritual, solving ambiguity, uncertainty, how to express, and love. My family may have particular rituals
Mhm.
How's that done publicly?
Uh,
What would your suggestion be for a public ritual in a diverse,
Yeah.
large country like America?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, right? So how do we engage in various kinds of rituals of public love that may not be broadly understood, right? Because of cultural differences, because of differences in traditions, something like that, right? My strong advice about that is not to fear for contingency, right? To fear for criticism, but take the risk that one inhabits the traditions and spaces one comes from first, right? So to present one's tradition, one's family first, as opposed to saying, well, is this acceptable, right? I mean, because so much of what we do is to try to police, like, what is acceptable, what is broadly going to be understood, as opposed to, well, what's going to make me feel, for example, morally confident, spiritually confident, right? And confidence is a tremendous one here, right? I mean, if any of you have been actors or performers, right? It's hard to walk onto a stage and feel shaky. Right? You need to have a good sense of oneself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Please.
So one of the things I could potentially extend your argument and say for public love to thrive,
Mhm.
in a number of ways you have to challenge
Mhm.
hegemonic masculinity as
Mhm.
it's expressed in American society in particular,
Yeah.
which I'm trying to sort of identify as barriers. So I just
Yeah.
want to hear your sort of thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a paradox of American culture, right? Where on the one hand, we, as you say, kind of white, masculine, heteronormative, affective repertoires, which is a long way of saying white guys tend to rule, right? They tend to dominate in regard to forms of expressions of emotional care, for example. And yet we value things like the feminine. So, and so part of it is just like this willingness to, this is related to the other question, about taking certain risks, right? And certain risks and also the courage to be patient that one's form of love, one's form of affection, one's form of publicness may not be accepted for a good long while, right? And that's a really hard proposition, right? And I grant that, right? That you have to have that patience and the kind of courage of one's convictions that even though you know you might be rejected, will be rejected, right? In the form of love that you want to present to others, right? If I came up to Donald Trump and I said to him, I love you, my brother, right? We might have an argument, right? But again, like, there's a certain kind of a vengeance of a declining emotional culture with something like Trump. It's like, and we all have to throw our stuff in there, regardless of where we come from. Does that get it? Yeah. Please.
I'm finding myself taking that scene in a little bit of a different direction. It's really enmity until he starts uttering the prayer.
Mm.
And when he's uttering the prayer, it seems to me that he's launched not so much into love or affection, but into a holy space.
Yeah.
And he kind of catches the wave,
Yeah.
and it becomes real.
Yeah. That kind of intensification at the end, right?
Right, and so I guess I wonder is this finally about love of God trump hatred of man?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Or
Yeah, I guess, so the kind of, what do I call it? The kind of the spirituality of the solidarity I was talking about is I think operating there too, right? Because when he's out there alone, as it were, at the bedside, trying to say the Kaddish, and trying to recall, he's like, it's like, this is a Catholic college, is that right? And so, you're saying your Catholic catechisms, right? You're thinking, oh, what was it that I learned when I was 10 and a half? And not really remembering until a kind of moment of purpose and appropriateness, right? And I think this is what catches Lewis off guard. He realizes that this is actually the right thing to do, right? And I think you're right. I mean, it is a love of God, but it's a prayer of peace and forgiveness, not just to God and the deceased, but for one's people, right? In the Kaddish, the recollection of Israel happens twice, right? In the middle and at the end of the prayer, right? So I'm praying for our people, for the redemption in your eyes. And so I'm not sure that they're exclusive, right? Does that make sense?
So what about the concluding comment? Your son.
You son of a bitch?
Yeah, how do you
Yeah.
make sense?
Mere humanity, right? I mean, a kind of, the imperfections that this is not moral purity, right? This is not moral perfection. This is like, I'm coming to you in my anger, in my hatred, in what should be an act of vengeance and justice. And yet, I found myself doing something that is right that I did not think to be acceptable or conventional. And so it's a statement, what? A frustration, right? Not only at Roy, but a frustration like, my God, what just happened here, right? And so, they're here that ritual is a kind of form of correction, right? And we know this from rituals, right? That rituals often correct behavior, right? Not always permanently, but they correct behavior insofar as meaning that they're different from how we act in ordinary life, outside of that sacred space. So the question is, how does one even begin to entertain something like public love if private love is not available to us, on the one hand, and that the various forms of hatred, trauma, disaster, catastrophe are so overwhelming in the world? Something like that? Right? I don't want to argue about preconditions, meaning like one can only engage in public love in a perfect form because one has private love, already in hand. That's why I was trying to gesture towards the end of the talk to these small rituals, a connection, shaking a hand, right, hugging somebody, right. And I'm not talking like bro hugs, like hey man, right. Like real hugs, real connections. They may not change everything in your life, but again, it's this correction of the body, correction of a mind, correction of the spirit, right? So what is it to collapse in heteronormative space, the distance between men, and to give a real hug, right? What's awoken there? Right? And again, it may not be a permanent thing, but to learn something from those instances, to learn something, put it this way, from the exceptions about love. So love may be exceptional to you in your private life. I don't know. You look like you've been well loved, but it may be exceptional to you in your private life. But it's to try to get to this point where you're trying to scale up. I've experienced some love with somebody, right? Some respect, some reverence, and I think, oh, so what would it be for me to extend that to somebody else? Not to default to cynicism. Because what's cynicism? Cynicism is maintaining a gap with others or reality. The irony. My students often do this. They don't talk to me. They just do this constantly when they're referring. Love. We're talking about love. I said, not everything is ironic, right? Meaning what? If you put it in quotes, you're not fully inhabiting it. You're not fully laying claim to it, right? I mean, how well can we love if we don't fully lay claim to that love? Or how do we love somebody if we don't fully claim to be with that other person, right? Does that get to what you're... Yeah, no, thank you. Please. Compatibility or hostility, you mean? Between capitalism and public love. Yeah, it doesn't appear that capitalism is going anywhere, right? And so I think you're touching on a sub-stream of the talk, which is that public love is a form of resistance, to capitalism, to self-interest, right? The dominant mode of American culture, whether political or otherwise, is radically self-interested still, radically atomistic, divisive, self-interested. We can talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but American libertarianism, right? Do not tell me, this kind of adolescent political culture, do not tell me what to do, right? And the bulwark for that is like, I'll become a capitalist so that you can't tell me what to do, right? And so, is there incompatibility between capitalism and love? Perhaps, right? Part of what's driving this project is to ask us to reinvest our hearts. Right? I teach at an undergraduate college, and my students are preoccupied with money. How am I going to pay off these loans? You guys have loans? No? Are you a loan-free institution? Right? Debt-free? Right? What am I going to do? Right? And so much of their present and future is animated by money, right? Negatively and positively. And when I ask them about passions, it's like a second or third priority. It's like, oh, I can think about passions, when I'm an old man like you, Professor Kim, all right? And, that's a real corruption. And it's selling, for you all, you're all 17 and a half to 22 years old, approximately, right? And that's a real bankruptcy to your own lives. If everything you do is about utility, if everything you do is about accruing wealth, if everything you do is about dominance, right? As opposed to care. I mean, one thing I didn't talk about in the paper, but, is certainly operating is tenderness. Right? I don't detect a lot of tenderness in capitalism, and yet what does life look like and feel like without tenderness? Right. Please. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to make a blanket judgment about $300 billion, right? But I'll go ahead and do it anyhow, right? I mean, who am I to question the motivations for philanthropy? I mean, the root of philanthropy, philia, right? Brotherliness or sisterliness, right? To give to a brother or a sister. I'm guessing most Americans don't think about that, in regard to philanthropy. I'm as guilty as anyone as saying, oh, look, a tax break, right? Which is to say, the structuring of things like philanthropy have been detached from the moral discourse of it. Not always, but often, right? So what would it be? So can we revive a culture and economy of philanthropy that's animated by love? I would love that, right? I think that would be very powerful. And my guess is that $300 billion would be more like $1 trillion. No, truthfully. I mean, we give a very small percent. You probably are all tithers here at Holy Cross, but we give a very small percentage of our income to charity. $300 billion, I'm guessing, was a very small part of the gross economy at the time, in 2014, right? And so it sounds like a big number, but we deal with the big numbers, right? So put it another way. What is it if we gave more of ourselves and our hearts as opposed to the bare minimum? I mean, Phil Knight at Nike gave $400 million to Stanford because they really need it. They're desperate. Stanford is a very underserved university, right? What is that doing? It's fortifying wealth with more wealth, right? At the same time, just across the bay, San Francisco State is going to gut its foundational college for ethnic studies. $400 million at San Francisco State would endow that place for perpetuity. Right? $400 million at Stanford buys you like a new locker room. Right? Where's the need? Put it another way, also, in regard to philanthropy, I mean, we tend to give to our own. Right? We tend to give to our own. Not always, but we tend to give to our own, the familiar. What is it to give to the stranger? Right? You want to come back?
That's the idea, though, right? There isn't a political system that would solve the lack of public love, right? I mean, these are acts of. I mean, there might be one that's more inclined to it than another, but it seems to be what you're saying. These are individual, irrational choices.
Yeah.
To sacrifice my well-being.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no political system.
Well, it may not be a political system, but look, I mean, public love is not going to happen if it relies solely on politics. Right? Yeah. And if anything, I think one of the, when we demand social change, right? It's not because politics is the end, but it's the means to get somewhere, right? So then, okay, so what would it be to try to create a politics that is defined and animated more by love than about self-interest, right? More by generosity than self-interest. even if it's hard to imagine. You need to do things like those small acts, right? So when I call it a politics of solidarity and sociality, meaning, well, what is it that you do together? How do you negotiate power? How do you negotiate authority, right? And in terms of politics, it is often a question of what we take as authority and what we consider authoritative, right? And so say public love was authoritative. What kind of politics would flow from that, right? And look, one of the things that I constantly come across when I've talked about this project is this, I get this response, sentimentality. Too soft, right? Too soft. And my argument is, let's be hard-headed and tender-hearted, right? This is not about being soft in the world, but it's also to change that impression, change that culture of expectation, where it's not the response saying, well, to love is to be soft. To love is to be, courageous, to risk, right? If I don't have private love in my life, to love publicly is a tremendous act of courage, right?
I don't disagree with this.
I know you don't.
Profound and involves.
No, I feel you as a brother, my
But
friend.
it might still be,
Yeah, yeah.
but it still might be irrational. It still might be, politically and socially irrational.
It may be politically and socially non-strategic in the short term. I'm not sure that it's necessarily irrational, right? Like if I'm trying to accrue and generate and to induce and find more love in my life, I would consider that to be highly rational. Right? Benny. Or Dr. Liu, sorry.
Does your thought on public love have a particular audience? I'm thinking about it.
Well, I'm at Holy Cross, you tell me. Yeah.
I've been wondering about the examples that you gave.
Yep.
Some of the ones who express love in angels are the big.
Mhm.
Antigone also was the relatively powerless. It's not Kyuman who was asked to express love.
Well,
You talk about you expressing love to Donald Trump. So, do you think there needs to be a different message in terms of public love to those who are actually on the other side of the power differential?
meaning what would public love look like if Donald Trump told me he loved me?
Do you need to tailor a different kind of message
Oh.
to that audience?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. No, I get that, right. So let's put it this way. On the one hand, there's a paradox operating, right? So public love is meant to be ambitious in general, and yet love is always highly specific, right? You love a particular other, right? And so when you say, is it tailored? Well, sure. Like, for me to love you, I'm not going to love you in the same way as I love my wife. It'll be a little awkward, right? Right? I'm not going to love you the same way I'm going to love my son. There are commonalities there, right? But you don't want to reduce, and this is where this sentimentality thing comes back, right? To reduce love to one thing, right? Or to the same modality, if you want to use that language, I think is actually selling love short, right? So it requires a tremendous amount of energy, imagination, work, right? So what is it to love a specific enemy, right? Someone who does not love me, right? It's rigorous, actually, right? It's and I think I used the word, it's strenuous, right? So to love without reciprocity, put it that way, right? To love without knowing that you're going to get love back is a kind of moral courage. And this is not an argument about saintliness. Right? You do it not because you're expecting love back, but perhaps in the long term, with our patience, we may receive love later. Does that make sense? Come back at me. Come on.
Okay, I'm thinking about someone like Antonio Negri. What was that book? I think it's called
Empire. Empire.
Something about revolution. Where he said we can't talk about love until you recognize the reality of
Oh, yeah. But, Heart and Negri, so these books, these big best-selling books by the Italian political philosopher Antonio Negri and the American comparative literature scholar at Duke, Michael Hart, right? Empire, Commonwealth, I can't remember what the third one is. Multitude, right? Unlikely bestsellers, right? But, prefiguring things like the Occupy movement, prefiguring mass political movements like in the Arab Spring. Saying what? That there might be these generative possibilities if we can think of revolution, if we can think about the world otherwise, right? And try to induce different political systems. Now, Hart and Negri, they say, actually, they use the language of love, right? They're saying a true revolution is going to be found in this massive global solidarity in politics of love.
But they have a different, I mean, as legally, have a different track. That when he talks about the powerful, he would say, as I can't remember the title of the book, it's not one of those three. He would say, you cannot even talk about love until you can really recognize the problem of the people.
Sure.
That would be his take to the people who are powerful.
Yeah. So, and I think.
So don't talk about love.
Yeah, no, I get it. And so to me, like, I understand why he says that, but I want to be more expansive and generous. Meaning, if we wait until that happens, this universal recognition of the poor, we're going to be waiting a long time for love, right? And so going back to the experience of love in ordinary life, right? Like small scale as well as big. Put it another way, you need mediating points to revolution if you're going to talk about love as revolution. Right? You're not just waiting for the toppling of the state. You're not waiting for the toppling of capitalism. Right? We got stuff to do along the way. Right? We got stuff to do along the way.
I don't question that. All I'm trying to say is that the message you're delivering is really targeting to a particular audience. It's small beginning, the particular group, but you might not be speaking the same message to the powerful group.
Well, I don't know. I mean, well, you know this. This past fall, I was teaching a course on radical love with Cornell West. And, that course, maybe the first quarter of the course was really born out of teaching Martin Luther King. Right? And so, King's message of the beloved community, King's message of dissent is very much to the powerful, right? Not to fellow travelers, as it were. In line with the questions that came before. Public love will not be understood immediately. Right? What's that Emerson line from Self-Reliance? Dare to be misunderstood. Right? I mean, dare to love knowing that you'll be misunderstood, which in conventional politics is perhaps not the savviest thing to do, but it may be the necessary thing to do. Right? Again, like to present imaginative alternative possibilities, as opposed to, well, what do we do given what we know about politics? What do we do given what we know about the dominant culture? But to challenge the dominant culture, right? To challenge those in power. Say, let's be and do and feel and think otherwise. It's not easy. I mean, for all the claims about sentimentality and softness, like this is not easy at all. Maybe one more? Or no more? Listen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.